The sea lanterns swung on their hooks as the ship took the swell, small circles of dim fire that shifted and breathed with each heave. The hull creaked in its bones. Tar and salt, and the faint sourness of spilled ale, knitted together in the wind, until the whole night smelled like a long memory of work. Tyrion sat below the gunwale on a coil of old rope, one gloved hand pressed to his ribs, as if to keep his stomach where it belonged. When he took his palm away, he looked at it curiously, as though it might have come away crusted with brine and humiliation. It had not. It trembled a little. That was all. Better? Sansa asked, and the lantern above them caught on a lock of her hair, smoking it with gold. It comes and goes, Tyrion said, trying on a smile. Like affection. Like surf, she said, and leaned her forearms on the rail. The sea had been speaking for hours, its steady, unhelpful sermon. But the closer the ship crept toward the mouth of the white knife, the more the voice changed. The big ocean breath of the bite roughened into a throatier sound, a river's push and protest. There was a line the ship crossed in the dark, invisible but felt, and from that point on Sansa heard home, though she could see nothing of it, only the vague purple smear of the distant coast and the net of stars above the mast. She wrapped her cloak closer. The wool was good. The cold came through anyway. It always had in the north, but that had been a child's cold. Cheeks stung, fingers stiffened, then thawed by a kitchen hearth and forgotten. This was a different cold, the kind that kept a hand on you and reminded you it could wait as long as it liked. The first gull found them just before dawn. It wheeled once, twice, and made a single loud comment of disapproval before striking for the shore. Tyrion watched it go. An omen, he said. It is a gull, Sansa said. Even omens have ordinary lives. They nest, they are eaten, they reek. She did not laugh. She had learned that laughter was not a gift, but a bargain. It might be taken as invitation. She did allow herself a small breath that fogged the air and was gone. The sunrise helped. It was a low fire laid in a grate far away, and it woke the frost on the ropes and the rivulets along the deck, turned everything thinly jeweled. Men came up the companionway, stamping their boots and beating their arms to gather heat from the day's meager offering. And the ship angled herself with a groan to meet the river's mouth. Sansa knew the white knife without having seen it for years. A child's eye had measured its bend and its broadening, the way the color changed with sky and season. Now the river presented itself to her, as if it had waited in the same posture, and the ship rocked its way into the current. Pines ranked the banks, dark and patient. Frost lay on their needles, as if the river had put its slender hand on all of them to count. They were not flying any colors. The captain had been particular about that, and Sansa had been grateful. She had learned that sometimes a lack of bravery was wisdom. Now as they moved past low islands of reed and ice, she imagined what a banner would have done in this light, the raw scarlet of a lion's mouth, the pale ghost of a direwolf jaw. And her stomach tightened. She had known banners all her life. They were not cloth. They were knives given wind. Tyrion rose and came to the rail beside her, measuring the distance to the shore with an eye that could hold detail even while his face was white from the seas rolling. He had refused a chair, refused to be carried. He always refused the helpful insult. He looked at the pine-choked bank, the water lifting and laying itself down again, and his mouth bent in thought. He looked like a man who kept words as other men kept coins, weighing them, testing their edges, never sending them into the world without deliberation. On land, he said, I am a more interesting person. In the north, she said, so is everyone. All of us, even the gulls. The gulls are already interesting. She admitted, they fight and steal and don't mind who hears. They belong in King's Landing. He made a noise that might have been a chuckle or a cough. Below deck, a barrel thumped. The crew called to one another without courtesy or malice. They were men whose politeness had been spent by work. Sansa felt the ship take a turn that she did not know by sight, but recognized anyway. The air had a certain smell she held in her chest and almost couldn't bear to let go. Cold river and pine pitch and distant smoke. Wood smoke, not the sick copper of city fires. She swallowed. For a moment the thought of her father's hall came with such force that it felt like pain. "Lady Sansa," the captain said, looming up with a courtesy patched together from habit and caution. His beard was so square it could have been a character in a play. "We'll take the last reach slow. White Harbor's watchmen want to count our teeth before they let us smile." "We are not smiling," Tyrion said. "Then it'll be quick," the captain said, immune to wit, and lifted his hand. The man at the tiller nodded. The ship did what she was told. Though every creak of her timbers suggested she might file a formal complaint later, Sansa had chosen no new name for the North. She had worn one in the Vale. Elaine Stone had lived on her tongue like a piece of grit for months. A scab she could not help but worry. And then another name that was not quite a name in the city, a way of speaking that kept her in doorways and shadows. Now, as the walls of White Harbor showed themselves, pale and solid, rising behind the river like a promise agreed to in writing, she stood in the cold daylight without a false name. The one she had was heavy enough. She turned her face a little so the wind could see her eyes. Tyrion's mouth quirked, but he said nothing. If he had suggestions, he kept them to himself. That, in Sansa's experience, was the beginning of a kind of trust. They could speak in private later. On deck, nothing belonged solely to you. White Harbor opened its gates to the river like a man opening his hands and showing that he kept no blade there. The walls were clean as bone. Seabirds stitched their ragged signatures along the battlements. The new castle's towers rose in white tiers that caught every shred of sunlight. Where King's Landing had been a stack of rooms and smells and noises tumbling over one another's thresholds like drunks, White Harbor arranged itself. Even its noise had order. The shout of a fishmonger, the clap of a sail, the high scold of a child, bells. As the ship slid into the flow of traffic, Sansa placed her palms on the rail and let the life of the city pass over her skin. Men in gray cloaks and men in brown, women with baskets, a boy with a goose under his arm whose webbed feet made two quick taps as it pecked his tunic, and all this set within the clean geometry of stone and water. The smell here was not kind, but it was honest. Fish, wet wool, cold iron. She watched a woman pour a pail of slush into the gutter and thought of a maid in her father's house, who had once swept the snow from the steps with a broom made of birch twigs, and afterwards shook it clean of ice crystals, as if it were jewelry. Memory had no mercy. It entered as it liked. The harbor watch came in a skiff with white painted shields that made their faces seem even more suspicious. The captain answered questions. He did not look at Sansa or Tyrion while he did it. He looked at the watchmen, and at a point in the air over their heads, and at the ship's rigging, and at the future in which his answers might be counted against him. Sansa held herself still. She felt Tyrion's caution beside her like the warmth from a candle left close to a window, present, faint, easily lost in a draught. The watchman's eyes moved, took measure, drew conclusions, and then nods, and the skiff scraped away along their hull, and the ship moved again, angling toward a berth. "Dockside lodgings?" the captain asked later. "We have the Lord's good will to test," Tyrion said. "He may yet decide it is worth more than ours." "And you are?" The captain's eyes did that quick, uncertain thing men's eyes did when they did not know which name could be safely used. "I'm a guest," Sansa said gently, and that was the truest word she had. "I hope to be welcome." The captain liked this answer. He was a man who spent his days accommodating weather. Her voice was a sort of weather he could accept. He bobbed his head to both of them, called orders, and the ship gave one last long sigh that everyone on deck answered without meaning to as the gangplank lowered. There were men there to meet them. Sansa picked out the Merman's Court's livery easily. Sea green cloth worked with silver seams in a way that suggested gills or leaves. At their center stood a man who required no livery to be identified. Lord Wyman Manderley's mass made a promise of solidity for the rest of them. He was not only fat, he was heavy as an anchor, as if he had been pressed into shape by the city's expectations and decided to keep that shape for their reassurance. He bowed without bending. "Guests," he said, and his voice moved slowly, measuring the room inside each word. "Welcome. It is cold. Let us not speak in it." Tyrion offered a half-bow pitched exactly at the angle that did not invite ridicule. "My Lord of Manderley," he said, "your walls are a comfort to eyes recently insulted by the ocean." "Water is water," Manderley said. "The difference is the company it keeps." His eyes went to Sansa then. They did not stare, but they did not slide away either. They were not greedy. They were aware. "Lady Sansa," he said. And at that Sansa's throat tightened, because he had put her name before the wind to see how it set. "My lord," she said, and bent her head. "Come," he said. "The new castle keeps a decent fire. We can put our bones near it and pretend we are less full of winter." They went on foot. It was the right decision and the necessary performance. The people lining the street had not been summoned. They had appeared as the tide does when the moon creeps its rope along the sky. They did not call out. The North had learned a new quiet this past year, a quiet that belonged to men who had counted how many they had lost and had no eloquence to match the sum. Sansa felt eyes on her cloak, on her hair. One woman's mouth made a shape as if tasting a name. A boy snuck forward 3 steps and then ran back to his mother clutching a sprig of something that might have been rosemary or some riverweed. He held it as if it could hold him in return. Tyrion kept his head uncovered and his gaze steady. If there was mockery, it stayed behind teeth. The new castle's hall accepted them with light and warmth, not generous but sufficient. When the doors folded shut, the outside world became a sharper thing at her back, as if the door's closing blade had cut it away. She stood and let the heat find her face, and looked into a room arranged for a conversation that would not be quick. Manderley gestured to the long table. A servant brought mulled wine with a heavy hand for nutmeg and less for sugar. A boy no older than 12 took their cloaks and peered at Sansa's hem, as if it were a map to be read later, under a blanket with a candle and a conspirator's care. Tyrion waited until Sansa had taken her seat, then arranged himself with a dignity that had cost him many years to purchase. "Lord Wyman," Tyrion said, "we bring no army, only names everyone has already heard. If it eases you, I can offer you mine first." "I was told your father's son had a tongue worth weighing," Manderley said. "Words like coin, tested, bit, mistrusted, and not easily spent. I will hear yours and hers, and then I will go stand in my own godswood, and remember that even when the sea comes up my river, the river is still itself. I am Sansa Stark." Sansa said before Tyrion could decide how to begin. She heard her voice and found it plain. "I was wedded in King's Landing and never asked. I have known too much fear since then. I have also known too much hunger and too much watching for the shape of a hand in a doorway. I asked to be recognized as my father's daughter. I have come home." "Yeah." Manderley was attached to silence the way some men were attached to cousins. They kept renewing the relationship, whether it pleased them or no. He let the quiet do its work, gave it long enough to feel full rather than empty, and only then turned his attention to Tyrion. "And you," he said. "I am the husband no father would choose," Tyrion said, as if he could save them time by bringing the worst object from the chest first. "I stood in a sept with her. The gods, of a kind, heard. The bed after did not. If the North has studied me well enough to fear me, it has studied me enough to know that I have done my share of harm with words and quite little with swords. I am not my house's favorite son, nor its most obedient. I bring you no lion, only a man. If you will have my cleverness without asking me to be more than I am, it is yours." Manderley held his cup beneath his nose and watched the steam as if it were giving testimony. "I do not have to be told," he said slowly, "why Tywin Lannister arranged a marriage between his son and a Stark girl. He did not do it to make a story with a pleasing end. He did it to draw maps with your lives. I do not like men who draw the North on paper. They mistel distances and make roads where there are none. But you bring me something that is not paper." He set the cup down. His hand was large as a ham and careful as a clerk's. "You bring me a Stark. The North is poor at forgetting. We keep the old things even when they do not serve us. customs and grudges, and sometimes houses. We have kept the memory of her father as one keeps an ember in a lidded cup. Show me that the ember can light a fire again, and I will entertain offering you tinder. But understand me, he said, and he looked at Sansa in a way that felt like an oath. You'll not... Winter does not care for pedigrees. Bah. Sansa found the words in her mouth before she had fully thought them. I do not ask you to fight a storm for me, she said. I ask you to stand in a doorway while I do. I will fight with what I have. I will fight with this hall and with the hot springs under Winterfell and with bread measured in honest loaves and with the names of my dead. I will not sell your sons to my fear. Manderley's lids lowered and lifted in a slow, satisfied blink. Good, he said softly. Good. There is a godswood here, though smaller than the one you remember. Before we speak of men and ships and foods that keep well salted, go to it. I will send word that you are arrived. News travels fast in winter because men spend more time close to fires and each other. Then see. He pushed himself up with a grunt that would have been funny in a smaller man. My lady, he said, and there was no irony in it. My lord. Tyrion's mouth moved in a way that, in another man, would have been habitual. With him it felt learned. He had taught his lips to match his intentions. I find godswoods better than septs for most things, he said lightly. That is because you find most things better than septs, Manderley replied dryly, and stroked his beard. Go. Outside, the godswood waited behind a wall that let the wind in. It was a small square of old thought, in a city that had mostly taken its conversation with the Seven. But the weirwood stood stubborn as a tooth. Its carved face was not fine. The shapes of its eyes were a little clumsy, as if the knife had been wielded by a man who had not wanted to become a priest, but had done it anyway, because his father had told him this was the way the house had always kept watch. Sansa stood before it, and the white bark's smoothness held light. The mouth's wound ran dark. She touched the trunk with the flat of her hand, and felt the cold there move into her palm, as if her blood had gone to look at something in the tree, and would be back in a moment to report. Tyrion kept to the edge of the grove. He did not mock. He watched the way the wind moved through the brown fern, and how the sound of the river grew and softened back here. He watched Sansa put her hand against the tree and resist closing her eyes, because closing one's eyes in front of other people is more intimate than undressing. He watched and said nothing, and in his silence, she felt a tenderness that was not pity. When she drew her hand away, she said, I will be judged. We are all judged, he said. The North prefers to do it with fewer words. Fewer, but not none. None is for the dead, Tyrion said. And even then the living find ways to speak for them. She looked at him. You will be set beside me as a test, she said plainly. They will watch to see if I will flinch from my own life. They will watch to see if you are in charge of it, he said, and smiled. I know something of being used as a measure. I will not repudiate you, she said. Did you think I might? I hoped you would not, he said, and his humor folded itself away. But hope is a lazy servant. I don't rely on it to fetch anything from the kitchens. Tell me what you need me to be, for them. Not lion, she said without thinking, and then softened her words with an effort she hated making. Not a voice for King's Landing. Not your sister's stiffness. Not your father's plans. And I can manage not to be my sister or my father, Tyrion said. The first requires less wine. The second, more. Be a man who keeps his promises, she said, and now her voice came easier. Be one who takes cold as other men do, and does not ask for a warmer seat. Be one who sees how the kitchens measure flour. Be one who stands in the yard while men set stones. Take insults as taxes. Laugh when you can, not when it costs other people. And his face had altered by degrees as she spoke, as a sky shifts without anyone noticing exactly when the light has changed. He bowed his head once. Yes, he said simply. They went back to the hall. Manderley had lost none of his size in their absence. He had acquired a tray of small pies which he was not eating, but examining as if each told a story. Whitefish, he said, reading them. Onion. Tall. A miserly hand with the pepper today. It will be corrected tomorrow. The gods find fault in the best of pies. Tyrion offered with a little flex of his fingers towards Sansa, making a show of contributing something harmless. They do, Manderly agreed gravely, and offered the tray. He ate. Talking with an empty mouth gives lies space to grow. Sansa took one. The crust was honest. The filling was hot. It burned the roof of her mouth and scalded up tears she did not mean to shed. She swallowed them with the bite. Men will gather quickly, Manderly said. Not all that I invite, and not all that come without invitation will do so for the same reason. Some will want to look at you and know if you still carry your father's face. Some will want to see what a Lannister looks like when he is not set in gold. Others will come to count those who do not come. I have known courts, Tyrion said lightly. They differ in their flowers and their soup, but not in their appetite. This is not a court, Manderly said, and his mouth curled slightly. It is a cold city with a memory. We do not ask if wine is good. We ask if it is enough. And is it? Tyrion asked. Manderly looked at the pie in his hand. It is never enough, he said. But there are days when it is not nothing. That must be enough for those days. His gaze returned to Sansa. Your father. Don't, she said. The word left her before she could smooth it. It had a roughness in it she had not intended to show. He nodded once. I know what it is to have a name in your mouth that you cannot swallow and cannot spit, he said in a tone that had no performance in it at all. Forgive me. I will say this, and then I will say no more of him, until you ask me. We remembered him here, not because he rode down our streets with the right number of men, or chose the correct hand to hold his gloves in, because when he asked for bread, he thanked the baker like a man who had not forgotten where bread comes from. Dan to. Sansa set the pie on the table. It made a plain sound. She met Manderly's eyes and found no trap there, only the steady weight of someone who had to be heavy because other men leaned. She nodded. By afternoon, the first of the lords and lesser men had begun to appear. A Serwyn came with a scar that tried to drag one eye down and failed, a Manderly cousin with hands like paddles and a lady's way of standing, a narrow man from Ramsgate who looked like a pig and had a house loyalty to no one but Winter. Two tall boys from the Riswells without a father to silence their impatience. A silent woman from Barrowton carrying a roll of parchment in a leather case as if it were a sword. They did not file in as courtiers do. They came as men come to a neighbor's yard after a fire. Not to gape, but to see if there is anything to be done, and if it is their job to do it. The hall filled without filling. There is a way people crowd quietly. The North knows it. Tyrion stood on the edge of things and arranged his face to receive contempt and suspicion politely. He found he could bear contempt more easily than pity. Where he was offered either, he answered with words that were smaller than wit and larger than mere courtesy. He was a man replacing broken tiles, one square at a time. Sansa sat in a great chair that had been dragged from a smaller room and placed beneath the antlers. It was too high for her by an inch. She did not shift. She took names into herself and set them beside faces where they might be found later when it mattered. She listened to the space between greetings. A woman's regard held one sort of question, a man's another. For the first hour, her palms dampened, as if her body were trying to teach her to be a girl again. She ignored it and continued to be a lady. When the hall had achieved that special density that means the day's business moves from the possible to the inevitable, Lord Wyman raised his heavy hand. The talk quieted, as snow does when men know they must hear the branch crack before they move. He did not make a speech. He tilted himself forward as a great ship might in a high wind and said, "You have eyes." They did. They looked at Sansa. Some looked quickly and away. Some looked as men look at a line on a page when they have not yet decided whether it is a legal deception or the truth they were hoping to find. Their eyes carried their house's loneliness and their hunger, and a number of dead they kept track of at night when it was too late to do anything about it. "You have eyes," Manderly repeated, "and you have the memory of your fathers. You have bread that must be stretched, and sons who do not want to marry the daughters you would have them take. You have a pelt that will not cover all your needs no matter how you cut it. You have a house in ruins that is not yours and that you love. You have a girl who is a woman, and a man who is a name you will not speak with love, even if heaven itself came down and told you to. And you have winter. There was a rumble that was not assent, and not denial. It was a Northman's way of admitting that the inventory was accurate. Here is what I propose, Manderley said. Each word a log set on a careful structure. You will go to the God's Wood. Not now, tonight, tomorrow, the next day, when you have finished telling your wives what you have heard and listening to their answers. You will stand before the tree, and you will ask yourselves whether the North remains a thing at all, when a Stark has nowhere to sit. Not whether that Stark is to your liking. Not whether you will be comfortable. Not whether you will be humored. Whether we remain what we tell ourselves we are if the girl does not sit. And then you will come back, and you will speak to me. And I will speak to her, and she to you. We may come to something. Or we may not. And we will each go back to our own cold, and declare ourselves satisfied. If you prefer, we can keep our houses as private graves. That is an honest choice. Dainty. The hall kept its breath like a disciplined animal. The little pauses inside words grew wider as men considered the space between themselves and one another. Sansa felt her heartbeat only in her throat. Tyrion's hand lay on the table, still and small, and the knuckles had a scar she had not seen before. She wondered who had given it to him and whether they were still alive. A Serwyn spoke first. The scar twitched when he opened his mouth. "What of Roose Bolton?" he asked, as if the name itself were a draft he must stubbornly swallow. "His men sit at the Dreadfort and in the hills and watch, and his ravens are tireless." Manderley's lip rolled back from his teeth in something that was not quite a smile and not kind. "I send him pies," he said. "He sends me letters. We are both generous men." "He is warden," the Risewell boy said stiffly. "He is something," Manderley said, and moved on. A woman from a small house near the shivering forest said, "The girl was wed to a lion in the sight of the seven. Will the old gods claim a marriage the new have already taken?" "Ben?" "The old gods claim trees," a man muttered, and someone laughed once and killed the laugh quickly. "The old gods claim what is theirs," Manderley said evenly. "And so do we." Sansa stood. The movement was small, but in a room like this it cut like a blade. Heads turned. She had not planned words. Planning had killed as many men as the lack of it. She let her mouth know her mind slowly. "My father taught me to count," she said. "To count loaves of bread the kitchen said would feed 100, and that fed 80 and 10 more boys who had learned to take 2 when no one saw. To count arrows gone in training. To count days until the first snow held. To count which men returned from a hunt and which did not. To count on my family and not on strangers. I have learned since that one must sometimes count on strangers anyway." She looked straight into the Serwyn's scarred eye and did not flinch. "I do not ask you to count on me because I was happy with my husband. I ask you to count on me because I intend to sit in a hall that belongs to my name and feed men as well as I can, and use the hot water under the stones to keep old people alive another winter, and not take a loaf for myself when I think no one is looking." "Down. Is the dwarf your lord?" A boy's voice scoffed from the back, and there were murmurs. The boy's face was the sort that had not seen enough to be careful. Tyrion turned his head to find him, and when he did, his face softened into amusement without malice. "Only if you sit in my pocket," he said, "and you are much too long for that. I might have a boot empty. Would you be satisfied to be lord of that?" "Mensch." The boy's chin jerked, but he tried not to smile. A hand, his father's, descended on his shoulder and squeezed. The boy ducked his head and made a show of examining a knot in the floorboards. The room's air loosened a half-breath. "He is my husband," Sansa said, and the words sat between them all like a bowl set in the middle of a table. "He will be my lord if I ask it of him. I do not ask it of him now. I ask it of you. Do not treat him as a sign hung about my neck. Treat him as a man who will stand in the yard and count stones with the rest." Now, she sat. The chairs had been made long ago and did not know her particular shape. She let her back accept the wood without complaint. Manderley's eyes were on her, as if he were memorizing each word to repeat later to someone who would ask the wrong questions, in the wrong order. The hall did not settle the matter then. It could not. The North is not a house that will be told what to do in an afternoon. Men left in dribbles, then knots, then streams. Manderley took the names of those who asked to speak again the next day. Sansa ate another pie because it was put in her hand by a girl whose pride in the crust was a kind of hospitality she could not refuse. Tyrion drank 1 cup of wine, then another with water, and then none. In the late afternoon, the light moved up the walls of the hall until it found nothing to hold and faded. Servants brought in trestles for those who would sleep in the hall rather than take their beds in a lodging they did not trust. Trust took warming like old soup. When at last the hall thinned to servants and the 3 of them, Manderley's bulk deflated a fraction, as if maintaining the shape of a lord were labor, and he would rest from it if left alone. He nodded to them. "Tomorrow, and then the next day," he said. "By week's end, we will have our answer or the shape of it. If we have only the word perhaps, I will make it a yes. But if we have a no, I will not dress it prettier." "Fair," Tyrion said. "Decent," Sansa said. "Decent is a better word than fair," Manderley said with a grunt. "Fair makes men grab. Decent makes them keep. Go. Sleep. We feed early here." They were given a suite of rooms that smelled of simple soap and beeswax, and a little of damp wool that would never go away entirely however many braziers one brought in. Tyrion ran his hand along the bedpost as if tallying the stubbornness of the wood. Sansa undid the ties of her cloak in front of the fire and felt its warmth find the skin along her spine slowly through wool and linen, and something more private. "You spoke well," Tyrion said. "Not as a compliment but as an observation to be entered in a ledger. You did not lie." "I have lied enough," she said. "It is like eating too much sugar. You want bread after." He smiled, and the smile had tiredness in it, and something like pain. "May I make a suggestion which is not advice?" he asked. "Try," she said. "When we go to Winterfell, go first to the kitchens," he said. "Then the yard, then the godswood. Let the hall be last." "Why?" she asked. "Because of where people's feet take them first," he said simply. "They will say, 'Ah, she's not here to sit. She is here to see.' The words will be yours, but let their thoughts be what you want the words to be." "You are good at this," she said. "Practice," he said dryly. "It has kept me alive longer than anyone thought likely. I will also go to the stores." "Yes," she said at once. "Count our winter twice." "And the walls," he said. "Men love to leave the stone to other men. They say, later. The North says, now." She looked at him, and for a moment, she saw him as a worker sees another worker, weighed by responsibility, short of sleep, alive to 100 small arithmetic questions no one hears spoken aloud. She thought of him in King's Landing, forced to balance accounts in a city whose appetite ran ahead of its purse, and whose vanity ran ahead of both. He had done what he could where men who were taller had done nothing. She thought of her gratitude as a coin. She did not spend it yet. She set it aside where she could reach it again. The morning came, and with it, bread that did not crumble, and a pot of fish stew that found every corner of the body and warmed it. They ate, and then ate again. Men returned to the hall with their answers and their questions. A day is a plank, and then another, and then another, and you are crossing a river without thinking of how deep it is, just the next step. At sunset, Lord Wyman came to their table and leaned on his hands and said, "The last of the men who needed to be heard have been heard. The first of the men who did not need to be heard but insisted have been tolerated. The woman from Barrowton eats her words as daintily as she eats her soup, and I will have hers again tomorrow. We will speak plainly in the morning. Be ready to hear yes and no in the same breath." They were. They received both. In the gray hour before dawn on the third day, snow began, a fine, persuading fall that insisted on the reality of winter. By noon it had piled modestly in the folds of the roof tiles and on the shoulders of men who had to stand too long in the yard. In the afternoon, Manderley convened a quieter thing than a court and a more binding thing than a conversation. "The North knows what it is," he said to the gathered lords, and to Sansa and Tyrion, and to the falcon that had found its way into the rafters and could not find its way out again. We have no patience for men who would teach us our own habits. This, then, we will send men to Winterfell in front of you, to see that the way from here to there is held by no one who thinks a winter road belongs to them by right. We will send stores enough for mouths we can count, and hope more men come who have not been counted. We will send letters to those who will not come, and we will make those letters say that if they stay a bit while. And Roose? A man asked. The name unsettled the falcon, and it dropped from its perch, flapped, found another. Roose, Manderley said, stroking his beard as if it were an old petulant parchment he knew by touch. Roose will be answered. He will be answered with stones and with smoke, and with the names of the dead we have not forgotten. He will be answered by the city of White Harbor, and by the house of Manderley, and by those of you who have found that you can swallow indignity without choking only when you drink it with grief. He will be answered by the North, which is a difficult and unhelpful neighbor when crossed. Now, then it is decided. A woman said the way one says a prayer, that is both petition and concession. It is begun, Manderley corrected. Decisions are for saucers. They hold small things that spill anyway. Beginnings are for bowls. He looked at Sansa. Lady, if you will be seen riding, ride. If you will go quiet, go. I will place men at your sides who do not ask too many questions and who are good with a boot in a rib when it is needed. Sansa's lips curved. I prefer men good with a loaf of bread. They make poorer songs, Manderley said, and better winters. He turned to Tyrion. And you, my lord? Yes, Tyrion said, before the request was fully formed. I will watch the sums. I will keep the men who have never eaten with a lord from doing it too quickly. I will count nails. I will ask questions of walls. Manderley grunted. And you will hear insults, he said. I have pockets enough, Tyrion said mildly. They can keep them there. The company rose. Men went to find their cloaks and their gloves and their horses. Sansa stood in the doorway to the courtyard and let the snow settle on her hair until a girl with a wooden comb darted up scandalized and began to brush it away with small, quick strokes. Let it be, Sansa murmured, and the girl's mouth made a round of apology, and she stepped back, hands knotted together in the nervous happiness of a servant who has been noticed. They rode the next morning along the East Road. It was a ribbon laid between white fields and the dark shrub of the wolfswood, and it cried out under the hooves of the horses like a thing that did not want to be woken. The men Manderley had given them were quiet in the usual northern way and talkative in a different one. When they spoke, they gave more information than a southerner would, told a small story, put a thing in its place in time. This is where the ice held early 2 winters ago. This is where an old man died, and his dog kept the birds off him for 2 days before someone found them both. There is a tree here that drops branches in wind and will catch your sleeve if you ride too close. Tyrion heard as a ledger hears, adding and subtracting, making a path through words to the choices ahead. He rode a solid, patient gelding the color of dirty wool. The horse had the temperament of a clerk in a reliable shop. He tolerated Tyrion because Tyrion did not ask him to go too quickly or show off. When a rabbit streaked across the road, he watched it with an unmoved dark eye and lifted his feet carefully to avoid slipping. A horse like this keeps men alive because no one writes a song about him. At midday they stopped near a wagon yard where men were patching the rim of a wheel with bent backs and muttered complaint and the usual holy oaths reserved for stubborn wood. Sansa dismounted and let her feet find the ground, a simple motion that felt like a prayer. She walked among the wagons, asked the men from what hamlet they came, asked how many mouths, asked whether anyone had a cold that would turn to cough and kill after nightfall if they were not careful. She did not speak sweetly. She spoke as if watching the weather, and men answered her because the words had the shape of sense in them, and because they were surprised to find a lady with a question that did not end in a favor for herself. Tyrion went to the wheelwright and asked what nails he preferred, and whether the road chewed spokewood, worse to the east of the next ford. The wheelwright squinted and then answered more because he had found a man who asked questions as a wheelwright thinks. A series of small questions, instead of one big one that arrives and leaves with noise. Tyrion bought 6 nails because the wheelwright offered them too cheaply, and this would give the man enough to buy the first rounds at the next alehouse, and speak warmly of a dwarf who counted to the right sums. So they moved. Not in splendor and not in weakness. A knot of men with a woman visible in their center, and a small man riding as if he had ridden this way all his life, which he had not. Sansa let the road's sights reassemble her. The way snow clung in beards like salt, the way a crow prefers a branch from which it can see 2 fields, the way women carry full buckets like a lesson in balance. The men Manderley had sent occasionally melted into the trees and reappeared, satisfied with their own absence. Twice they found tracks on the road that made men draw bows and think about how they would like to die if they could not choose to live. Twice those tracks resolved themselves into harmless things, once a cluster of deer prints, once the messy scribble of a child who had been dragged laughing on a rope behind a sledge and had kicked with both heels. Tyrion looked back at the child tracks twice. He liked their extravagance. On the 3rd evening, the roofs of Wintertown showed themselves through the firs, low and stubbled and smoking. The smell came first, a concentration of all the human winter smells that are at once comfort and warning. Ash, stew, unwashed wool, shit, stew again. Sansa's breath went tight in her chest and eased slowly. She had been bracing for ruin. She found endurance instead. The houses had suffered the attention of soldiers and of lonely men. Many had recovered the older, duller pattern of damage all houses take because life happens in them. A woman hung a pot from a hook and stirred with a spoon that had been stroked into a left-handed shape by 20 years of use. A man mended a harness with bad thread because the good thread was gone or close to it. A boy ran with a stick and was shouted at by 3 different women and grew years on the spot for the honor of the scolding. Dogs debated the merits of being alive loudly. They did not linger. The way up to Winterfell presented itself not as a road but as a forgiveness, the land allowing you to climb if you didn't step stupidly. Sansa looked up and found the walls, black in places where fire had gotten instructions and had obeyed too enthusiastically, gray where the stone kept its pride, white where frost had made its case and won at least for a night. There was steam, and the sight of it made her knees feel untrustworthy. The hot springs breathed. They had gone on breathing when men had taken breath or lost it. She had dreamed of this vapor in rooms where there was no heat, and now it was in front of her face like a word. The gates were open, not from neglect, but because the men who held them had decided that if the gate were shut, men would knock, and then the gate would have to be opened, and this would put them to a greater inconvenience. 2 men in helms that did not match their armor stood at the arch. Their faces were wind-chapped. They put their hands to their spears, not to threaten, but to help themselves stand up straighter. They recognized the Manderley men, and recognized Sansa after they had been given time to understand what they were seeing. "Lady," one said, and his voice betrayed him. He had found himself saying a word he had expected to use again, but had not expected to use now. The other nodded as men nod when they have no words to put in the place of the thing they have seen. Sansa dismounted. She did not ask to be announced. The yard had changed. The familiar scaffolding of daily life was gone in places and rebuilt in others. There were piles of stone that looked as if they had been arranged carefully to be undone later. There were men who had the stance of men who would like to be under orders they respect. There were women who had made a map in their heads of which rooms were warm, and which rooms would be warm if they burned this and that, and not too much of the other. There were children who had already decided that if a girl dropped her scarf anywhere in this castle, they would know it before she did, and bring it to her and take a reward, and then lose the scarf later when they were pretending to be knights. Tyrion slid from his horse unhandsomely and took a breath that looked like a decision. He did not look at the great hall. He looked at the kitchens as if he had made a pledge. He looked at the steam that left the bathhouse. He looked at the broken bridge between the bell tower and the armory and the sullen face of the first keep, where it had been blackened and then washed by months of weather. He looked at the tower stairs as a man looks at a set of truths he must climb one at a time. Sansa walked across the yard and it changed around her. Not in the way a great magic changes things, but in the way that the shape of a room changes when someone who belongs to it enters. Men took a breath as if to test whether the air had altered. A girl dropped the pail she was carrying, and then swore under her breath and splashed water over her own shoes with quick anger at herself. Sansa put her hand on the stone of the nearest wall, and it felt like the skin of an old friend. A woman with arms like fence rails and a chin made for orders came forward. "My lady," she said, and there was the plain strength of a carpenter in it, something measured and square. "I am Hilda Stonehouse. No house in truth. My father said the name came from a joke that got out of hand. I keep the kitchens that are kept and curse the ones that aren't. If you come to see what's left, see." "Beh, I do," Sansa said. "We will sit later." "Good," Hilda said simply and turned. Sansa followed her through the low door and into the heat. The kitchen was a working one, which is the best kind to find when you are trying to bring a house back from insult. The hearth bricks were soot black and honest. The big table bore knife marks like writing. There were loaves cooling on racks set near a window, so the steam could find its way out. One pot bubbled with a confident sound. The others simmered and waited on orders. The people moved like people who had learned each other's rhythms in the way of those who shared danger and meat. A boy with hair sticking up like new thatch stirred a thick brown thing with a paddle, and did not look to Sansa to see if she approved, and did not pretend not to care. "Flour's short," Hilda said, the words loud enough for the room. "Salt is salt. We dried a lot of mushrooms out of the wolfswood because we could not help ourselves. Cabbages keep because cabbages decide for themselves, and do not listen to women who would like them to soften." "Then, where do you keep the flour?" Sansa asked. "In the store the rats like least," Hilda said, and her mouth made a grim amusement. "They say we will go there later, and by the time later comes the men with cats have done their work." Sansa smiled. "Show me." Hilda did. The stoop to the lower stores made Sansa's legs remember her girlhood. The smell did not change. There is only one old stone smell. The stone under the world shows itself in that scent, and you know you are descended into the true thing. The flour lay in sacks that had already been moved twice in the last season, from damp corner to less damp corner, and back again with each change in the weather. She lifted the edge of one and let the grain sift through her fingers. It was clean. It was not enough. Tyrion appeared at the door and did not enter until Hilda waved him in with a floury hand. He had found a ledger somewhere or made it out of a stack of old accounts. He held charcoal like a quill, and already there was a smear along the side of his hand where the words had resisted being contained by the page. He looked at the sacks, then at Sansa. "We will cut the loaves by 1 finger's width each starting next week," he said quietly, "and pretend we always made them that way. People notice," Hilda said without rancor. "They notice if they think you have hidden something," Tyrion replied. "If you show them the knife and say, 'Here is what I do, and here is how I do it, and here is why,' they still mutter. But their mutters are short." Hilda considered this and then shrugged. "We will try." The old man above us used to keep a shadow loaf, baked the old size and kept it on the counter so people could put their hand to it and say, "The bread is still bread." It was stale as a lie by the week's end, but it calmed a few. "Good," Tyrion said. "Do it and throw it away with ceremony." Sansa ran her finger along the ledger's edge. "We will need to trade," she said. "White Harbor can spare less than it wants to. Some of the inland hamlets had good onion last harvest, because the frost held late and the worms held later." Hilda's eyes narrowed in interest. "I do not deal with White Harbor," she said. "White Harbor deals with the steward." "You will deal with them now, through me," Sansa said. "And when the steward returns to his ledger, he will find the numbers and the men attached to them, and not be surprised. We will buy onions with saltfish for a month, and with soap for 12 women to make their own for the year. We have soap." "Done?" "Plain soap," Hilda said. "The kind that is honest and stings your eyes. Not the kind that thinks well of itself." "Good," Sansa said. "I have known soap that lied." Tyrion had been counting in his head. "If we can keep a roof over the glass garden," he said, "we will have green longer than fields have any right to give us. You can eat honesty all you like, but it is a poor remedy for scurvy." "Yes," Sansa said, and her throat tightened again briefly at the words, "glass garden." Let's see it. They had to pick their way carefully around fallen stone, and Tyrion's horse, which he had refused to leave until he knew where it would be stabled, snorted at the steam as if the earth were venting its temper. The glass garden had taken hurt. One of the long roof frames had collapsed, and the broken panes lay like a mirror dropped by a careless god. The wet heat inside the intact section fogged their faces as they lifted the canvas that had been thrown over the gap. It held the smell of growing things, and in the winter, that smell is a psalm. A gray-faced man with broad fingers and a mouth that had learned to keep quiet in order to outlast fools stood up from his crouch among the beds. "Don't expect miracles," he said without turning, then turned and startled and ducked his head. "My lady, my lord, I say things sometimes without thinking. I tell my wife I was born with a hoe in my hand, and you know the kind of man that makes me." "The useful kind," Tyrion said easily. "What fails?" "The frame," the gardener said. "The wood is old, and did not ask for this fire, and did not consent to the cold after. We propped it, and we prayed, and we did the things that aren't either of those. Tied, braced, cursed, and it still wants to lie down. The panes? Well, glass is glass. It breaks because it is told to. We've patched. We could keep a little green if we can keep the wind from telling it to die." "Bender, what can you keep alive now?" Sansa asked gently. "Cress," he said. "Silly stuff, but it gives a body reason to live. Onion greens. A stubborn little lettuce that pretends it isn't what it is and gets away with it for a while. 2 sad cabbages like monks who've chosen to think only of God. Parsley, that believes it can live anywhere and is usually right. A lemon tree that I speak to at night because it was a foolish gift from a southerner years ago. And I am not going to let it die merely to prove a point about where we live." "Bow." Sansa smiled quickly. "Let's keep the lemon tree out of pride if not out of sense," she said. "If we can mend the frame, can you keep the rest?" "If I can mend the frame, I can feed the children a handful of green a day," the gardener said. "And that is more than nothing." Tyrion squatted by one of the supports and tapped it with his knuckle, and considered the sound it made with a craftsman's attention no one had taught him to have. "We can sister the beams," he said. "Not pretty, but we can make the support double. We need oak if we can find it, not pine. Bolts, not nails. Rope. Men who have lifted more than words." "We have men," Sansa said. "We have fewer bolts." "I will write to White Harbor," Tyrion said, "and then ride 2 miles out to a man who makes things and say, 'If you give me bolts at the old price, your name will be spoken in the hall for 4 seasons, whenever men eat. If he insists on the new price, I will do the same, but the words will not be as warm.'" "You are learning the North," Sansa said. "I am learning what men want," he replied. "It is the same thing in most places, just tasted differently." They walked the yards until the light began to change. Later, they would sit in the great hall. Later, they would call men and give them their tasks. Later, they would send letters tied with twine instead of ribbons. Now they counted. Now they learned which doors swelled in the damp and which kept their honesty. Now they sniffed the air in the armory and found oil where there should be oil and rust where there should be none. Now they counted blankets. Now they discovered a stack of good clay bowls someone had hidden under a table during the sack and left there because they had died or fled. Hilda crowed when the bowls were found as if someone had told her a joke that was finally worth the hearing. Tyrion stood a long time with his palm flat on a section of wall where the stone spoke of old heat from the springs below. In the afternoon, Sansa went to the Godswood. She went alone and yet not alone, because the North is full of eyes that are not in men's heads, and she felt them. The small watchfulness of birds' bright minds, the patient attendance of things that do not understand words, but understand blood and breath. Winterfell's Godswood was not a polite square like White Harbor's. It was a memory of a forest told with conviction. Snow lay in the crooks of the branches and in the folds of the earth. The heart tree stood as it had always stood, as if men's axes had never been very interesting to it. Its face was older and better cut than the one in White Harbor, its mouth smeared darker, the eyes deeper set. Sansa put her hand on it and did not ask for anything and did not promise anything, and did not confess. She stood. Standing is sometimes the only devout act a body can manage. When she turned, she found Tyrion at the edge, not inside the sacred line of her childhood. He had come as far as he could without presumption. She was surprised to find that it pinched her, not as offense but as a recognition of something difficult and true. He did not belong here, not really. He belonged outside the circle, doing his work with numbers and patience. Taking the insults the North tossed him, because it needed to test whether he would keep his feet. He had known this, and had not made a show of it. His face was thoughtful, in a quiet way, that was not for influence. He had been counting sheaves of wheat, and now he was counting the time she was taking, and deciding how much he would allow men to see that he cared. How many? She asked when they walked back, and he understood what she meant. Enough to begin, he said. Not enough to end. But beginning has its own power. I have told Hilda to salt and dry more than she likes. I have told the men who oversee the pigs that we will be keeping 2 more breeding sows than last year, and if they complain I will give them a long lecture about arithmetic. I have told the steward to find the man who knows which roof leaks only when the wind is east. I have told the boys that the best thing to steal this year is kindling for old women who cannot walk to the yard, and that I will hear of any boy who steals from a man's boot, and I will make of him a lesson. Nandurus, you have been busy, she said. I am trying to earn my keep, he said softly. You are, she said. That night, the great hall held a warmth beyond the fire. Men took their meat with a calm that had not been present in the afternoon. The dogs lay where they were told. Children appeared at the edges of the room and were repelled gently, or allowed to stay, depending on the kind of child. Sansa sat and did not make a speech. She ate. She asked Hilda where the onions had been kept. So that they did not sprout, and listened to a long answer about baskets and drafts, and the way a window will lie to you in winter. A bard tried a song and the room rejected it with a collective twitch. It had been a southern thing, and men are patient with many offenses but not with boredom. He tried another, and was answered with a more complex silence that permitted him to continue. Tyrion watched the crowd as a shepherd watches his flock, not to count the sheep, but to count their moods. He saw one man take another's cup, and then return it without offense. He saw a woman put her spoon in the bowl of the woman beside her, and taste and say a word that made them both laugh. Winter is made manageable by such economies. Later, after the hall had softened into the low talk of those who were not yet ready to surrender to their blankets, a messenger arrived. He wore the dust of the road as if it were his clothes. He came straight to Hilda, not to Tyrion, and this pleased Tyrion. Hilda wiped her hands on her apron and took the small sealed thing with a nod and brought it to Sansa in the way of a woman who would always bring the day's bread first. Sansa broke the seal. The wax had been pressed with a ring that carried an old wolf. The handwriting was careful and young. It belonged to someone who had not expected to be writing to a lady. My lady, it read. We still have the loom. The soldiers did not burn it because it looks like work, and they hate work. My mother says we can make cloth if we can get thread. If we cannot get thread, we can make new clothes out of old ones, and pretend it was always meant to be like that. We have the small boy with the hair. He keeps sticking things through the fence. We also have the woman who remembers when your father came to market and bought 2 geese and gave one to the old man who always sits near the well. She tells that story every week. Please send word if we should come to Winterfell or keep the door here. We will do as you say. We killed a pig, but it was too much. We could bring a half if you have salt. Nenda see. There were names at the bottom, a list that felt like a poem. Sansa folded it and set it beside her on the table, and did not realize that her hand had closed into a fist until Tyrion's finger tapped her knuckles lightly. Tell them to come, he said at once, reading the same sums. The pig will rot if salted badly, and will feed men badly later. The loom will do more work in a larger room. The boy's hair will cause trouble wherever he is, but at least here will be our trouble. Right, Sansa said to Hilda. And send a man who can count miles and not be shamed by saying he cannot do it quickly. Tell them we will feed them when they arrive and afterward, and that we will pay for thread with small coins and with the names of the women who will use it. Once they come, counting their strength becomes our duty." Hilda wrote, "Writing in the north is often a craft men make look like a battle." Hilda made it look like bread making. She had learned her letters to keep her house pots in the right rooms. When she was done, she sprinkled a little flour on the ink to dry it, and shook it off with a small shake of her hand that made the white fall in a fine snow onto the rushes. She rolled the letter and sealed it with the kitchen stamp. A small wolf a child had carved, and nodded to the messenger, who had eaten without admitting he had. The next days were work. Men woke before dawn or after. Winter arranges time differently. Tyrion took a place in the yard with a brazier at his elbow, and made it known that anyone who had a question about the doing of anything could bring it to him if they did not mind an answer that would involve counting. He became the man men came to when they were about to waste energy. He kept men from lifting the same stone twice. He kept the goats out of the stores. He found a pile of iron bars that had been meant for something else, and turned them into bolts with a man who had 2 fingers missing and a grin like an extra candle in a room. He told jokes, but always at his own expense, or at the expense of work, never at the expense of a man's dignity. He learned girls' names and boys, and did not forget them and used them when they had done something worth the hearing of their own name. Sansa took a place in the kitchens and in the small room off the great hall where she could sit with women and talk about the kind of things men pretend not to care about, until there is not enough, and then care about very much indeed. She sat with a woman whose hands shook when the fire popped because her son had died in a way that involved fire. And Sansa did not say it would be all right. She sat with 3 girls plaiting rope from reeds, because rope is a thing that disappears like snow, and must be made again and again. She sat with a boy who wanted to be a knight, and told him that being a knight had to do with standing, when standing meant your legs hurt, and not very much to do with swords. She walked through the glass garden with the old gardener, who introduced the lemon tree to her as if it were a dog, and she said a formal greeting to it, and felt foolish, and then less foolish than she had expected. On the 4th day, a small cavalcade arrived from White Harbor, with bolts and rope, and a letter sealed with Manderley's heavy imprint. Tyrion broke it and read it, and smiled a little. It said, "We are told the road is cleaner of men who ask for money and offer nothing. We are also told that if you keep telling men why you do what you do, they will begin to ask you before they do what they do. And this is efficiency or tyranny, depending on what you call it. I am pleased. I have sent you what I could, and a man who knows how to make a frame hold longer than it should. He is called Jory. He looks like a sheep. He is not." And Jory looked like a sheep. He also looked at the glass garden and sniffed and said, "If we had a carpentry bench we could make a proper join." And when he was told there was no bench, he looked at the ground and said, "If we had 4 flat stones and a plank." And when he was given those, he said, "If we had men who knew how to mind their thumbs." And then he showed them how to mind their thumbs. And then he showed them how to mind their thumbs. Tyrion watched and learned. Sansa watched and felt the rare kind of contentment that comes when men who know what they are doing do it, and you know enough to stay out of their way. On the 6th night, as the blue hour placed its hands on the gray edges of the world, Lord Wyman, Manderley came. He did not bring a parade. He brought a small party and a large voice. And when he stood in the yard at Winterfell, he tilted his head back and looked at the towers with the expression of a man looking up at an old friend who has been ill and is finally standing. "This is better," he said, and the words were a blessing. "It smells like soup and stone instead of ashes and men's fear. That is not nothing." He turned to Sansa. "If you will take it, the city has a gift. We take gifts that we can afford to repay," Tyrion said quietly. Manderley smiled under his beard. "Clever man," he said. "We can afford to give you this because you have already given us enough in return to make it not charity. And besides," he added with rude humor, "it is ours to give. We can do as we like." "What is it?" Sansa asked. "A seat," he said. made of wood cut from an old ship that would not sail anymore, carved with no taste in particular, but with great enthusiasm, by a man who owed me favor and who had just discovered his wife was with child. It will sit in the hall until such time as you decide to have another made. It will sit there with your name on it. Banderande. They carried it in. The hall received it without fuss. It was not a southern thing. It was sturdy and a little ungainly, and one arm ended in a curl that looked accidentally like a fish. Sansa put her hand on its back and felt a thrum under the surface as if the wood remembered the sea in its veins. She sat, and the hall liked it. There is a feeling a room has when a chair finds its owner. Manderley stood, and his men stood behind him in a deliberate half-circle. The crowd had arrived as they will when a thing is happening that does not require their presence, but will later require their opinion. Hilda stood in the doorway with her arms folded and flour on her cheekbone like war paint. Jory had a smear of pitch on his ear. The old gardener was not in sight. He had no time for ceremony when the lemon tree had decided to attempt fruit. "People of Winterfell," Lord Wyman said, and the words rolled easily out into the room because the room had been wanting them. "You know why I came? I came to see our own work, and I came to see whether we will do the next thing. We will. We will name this lady, and we will put her in this chair, as it has been put under her. And we will say that this house belongs to this name. We will keep our own. We will do it in the way of the North, so any septon who wishes to write about it with a pretty hand can do so if he likes. And we will also do it where the old eyes are. We will do it tomorrow morning at the Heart Tree." Then Banshor. He turned his head and looked at Tyrion without lowering his voice. "And we will set her husband where he belongs if he keeps to his own place," he said. "He will not speak for us. He will speak for himself and for his lady if she bids him. He will be our man if he does our work. If he ceases to be our man, we will tell him so without embroidery. He will not be surprised." Tyrion inclined his head. "I am rarely surprised, my lord," he said dryly. "I had a childhood devoted to preparing me for disappointments." A ripple of laughter traveled through the room like a small wind through snowgrass and left behind something looser. Men exhaled. Women set their weight differently on their feet. Even the dogs rearranged themselves. The naming in the godswood the next morning was done in cold. We do not have words for. The kind that makes your teeth ache, and your eyes weep without sadness, and your ears ring like bells hung in ice. The weirwood's face looked less carved than it had the day before. Snow had traced its brows and put a small white line along its upper lip, like a man who had forgotten to wash. Men and women stood with their hands under their arms and their breath shocked out of them, and the world was very quiet. This was right. The old gods do not like plenty of talk. Sansa came forward with her cloak fastened by a plain pin. The pin had been cut from a piece of old iron found in the yard. It had not been polished. She liked its bluntness. She stood where she had stood as a girl beside her father on days when petitions were heard outdoors because inside it was too crowded and too loud. She stood, and the cold did what it would to her. Tyrion stood a few paces to her left and behind, not because of protocol he had been taught, but because he understood geometry and men's eyes. Manderley stood and did not shiver because fat sometimes keeps the cold out, and sometimes keeps it in, and Lord Wyman had learned to befriend his own body long ago. There was no speech. The maester was there because maesters cannot bear to be left out, and he held a roll of vellum whose edge had once been smooth and was now rough where mice had tried it. He unrolled it and read all the names of Stark men he had copied out, and the air gave them back slowly, as if picking up heavy stones from the bottom of a river and setting them on the bank one by one. It took long enough that men grew uncomfortable in the way men grow uncomfortable when they are asked to remember too many dead in a single morning. This too was right. Comfort was cheap coin in a godswood. When he was done, the maester shifted his weight and looked at Manderley and said nothing, because this had to be done without pretty words. Manderley took Sansa's hand. He had big hands and he did not grip tightly. He held her as one holds a tool one intends to hand to the next man without having put your own shape into it. "Sansa," he said, and his voice left any title behind, as if he were shaving fat off meat. "You are of this place. Sit in it." He turned his palm and placed her hand on the tree and stepped back. The tree's bark felt like a thing that had decided to feel as it liked and did not consult you. Sansa put her other hand on the bark and set her forehead against it and let the cold make a mark there. When she stepped back, she was not different in any visible way. Ritual rarely changes faces. It changes where a face belongs. Men exhaled together as if the air had been saved up for a long time. Women laid their hands briefly on their bellies or their hearts. A jay swore loudly in the branches and then seemed embarrassed for having made a sound and flitted away. Manderley turned to Tyrion. He did not ask him to come forward. He did not offer a hand. He said, "You are the husband. This does not make you the North. If you will live, live with us. If you will take a slice of this bread and call it your own, and leave the rest for others, you will find your teeth broken. If you will do what the house needs, you will be given a corner by the fire when you are old. By the fire when you are old." Tyrion bowed, not low, but lower than usual. "I will live," he said simply. "I do not say I will love this cold, my lord, but I will live." "Men shall." A small no-one-owned voice from near the back said, "He will freeze like a frog." And a larger voice said, "Hush." And then there was a long moment in which everyone decided to be honest in his own way. Winter is a great introducer. It makes men say what they have meant to all along. The naming done, the people took their breath back, and then went to find ways to spend it. The day's work, after all, was still the day's work. Positions had been settled and chairs arranged, and a thing had been said that would echo into the other things. Now there were stalls to mend and fires to set, and a leak in the small roof off the armory that had decided to become worse in the last week, and would brook further delay only if the world ended. Sansa went to the kitchens and ate a bowl of stew she could not entirely taste. Tyrion stood near the yard and spoke with 3 men about the business of sledges, and whether oxen or men were better for dragging stone when the ground was like this. Notes arrived from all quarters, like birds, some tied to new-cut twigs, some to strips of leather. One pressed into the hand of a boy who had no business near the hall, and had come anyway, because he had a letter and a very serious face about it. There were names. There were arguments. There were offers. There was the first ordinary trouble of a lord's house returned to being a lord's house. 2 men both claimed a length of rope. A woman wanted her brother released from work on the walls, because he had bad lungs. A pair of lads had fought and one had knocked the other into the brine pool, and he had shivered with cold and with fury and had threatened to take the other's dog that night. Hilda wanted a new pen and would not say where I except that the old neen had gone to muck. Sansa heard and decided and deferred, and watched in her mind all the small things move where she had placed them, and felt the hall begin to grow into the shape she wanted for it, as if the walls themselves were contemplating a new old purpose. By week's end, the frame above the glass garden held. Jory had stood under it and let the men take their hands away, and had counted to what seemed to him a number that should represent trust, and then one more to be sure. It did not collapse. He looked pleased with himself and then quickly embarrassed, as men do who are not accustomed to a crowd watching their ordinary triumphs. The lemon tree took this as permission to produce a single new leaf that only Sansa and the old gardener would notice. The pigs were counted twice a day until one of the boys who did not enjoy counting began to enjoy it at the precise moment he realized he could do it better than the other boy. Lord Wyman left with his party, carrying back to White Harbor the news that it was worth sending 2 wagons of grain and a wagon of gossip. He left behind a quiet promise to speak to certain men when letters came from the Dreadfort, with the tone of command cats use when they address birds. The lords who had come and gone sent small signs of allegiance in the northern way. A bundle of good tinder, a woman who knew salt pork best who would come for a month and then return home with a bag of flour and a story. A pair of good socks knitted by a girl with a crush on a boy who needed his feet to be warm if he were to love her properly. Tyrion made a pile of such things in his ledger, under a heading he called by no name. He kept account. He also kept a map in his head of words spoken and not spoken. The Serwyn had bowed to Sansa and to him and had said, "We will see," and had meant, "We have decided. We are only waiting to discover whether we regret it." The woman from Barrowton had smiled with one corner of her mouth and had left her parchment on the table, and had looked at Hilda's hands when Hilda waved to a servant, and had decided something based on flour and confidence. The Risewell boys had stopped jostling each other after the second day, as if the house itself had placed a hand on their collars. At night, Sansa sometimes went to the roof walk above the great hall, and stood with her cloak tight and her breath employed as fire, and looked out. Winter's sky is so crowded. The stars make more sense there than they do in the south. They look like nails in the lid of a chest. In the yard below, there would be one or two men still speaking in low voices, because the ground holds words at night, like a secret. In the distance, there would be the white of the lands, a whiteness that was not empty as southern men think but full. Of animals, of men who knew how to keep their heads low, of wind moving along lanes it had worn for centuries, of things you cannot name because the names you have are sly and soft, and the north's edges are neither. Tyrion took to walking along a line of stone laid just at the edge of the old godswood, where the snow never remained long because of the ground's temper. He counted lights. He listened to the way the house settled, each timber's complaint. He had always favored words he could put in order, and now he found pleasure in the muttering of stone. The North was a teacher that did not care whether you learned. It set its lessons in front of you anyway. He learned that he did not need to be liked if he was trusted. He learned that the cold could be negotiated with in the mornings, but not at night. He learned that Hilda would tell him the truth when he needed it, and would scold him when he used too many words in a room that wanted none. Sansa and Tyrion did not speak of King's Landing. Once, a boy in the yard asked Tyrion if the Red Keep was truly red, and Tyrion said, "Only when it has embarrassment." And the boy's laugh made a thin white plume in the air, and that was all. Once, Sansa saw a man with hair the color of Lannister gold, and her stomach leaped and then settled, and she went on. That kind of going on is the work of a life. On the 8th day, a raven arrived with a message that smelled of the Dreadfort. Cold and iron and old cruelty. It did not ask. It named. It named Roose Bolton Warden of the North, as if that was something a man could be by proclamation alone, and it instructed Winterfell to prepare to receive his son as steward until his own return. There was also a line at the bottom, written in a different, more florid hand that lingered on its own curves too long, that said, "The lady will be treated with the honor due to her station by this house." Tyrion held the parchment with 2 fingers, as if it were something he did not want to catch. Sansa read and said nothing, and then said, "Then word to White Harbor." "We will send word," Tyrion agreed. "But we will also set men on the East Road and the Barrowlands. We will also speak to the Umbers and ask which of them is laughing and which is crying, and whether the laughing one is safe to sit with. We will also tell Hilda to bake twice the bread tomorrow and half again the day after, and then not as much after that, because there is a way to make a house look ready to receive an insult without wasting food." Let me see. Hilda, who had been at his elbow as if kitchens grow men as they grow herbs, nodded once. "I have already told the boys to clean the long tables and the short ones, and to leave spots on them that look like they have always been there so as not to encourage men to be vain." "Good," Tyrion said. Sansa went to the godswood. The snow had crusted. Her boots broke it. She stood beneath the heart tree and felt its old attention. She spoke softly. "I do not know what to ask for," she said aloud, because greater devotions had always been tricky for her and honesty seemed the better instrument. "So I ask for the same thing as yesterday. Strength and a little luck and someone to hold the other end of the rope." She thought of roped sledges. She thought of the spring under the glass garden pushing its warmth up through stone. She thought of Lord Wyman sitting in his chair like a continent and making jokes, because jokes are sometimes the only kind of punctuation one can offer to the sentences of war. She thought of Tyrion and the angle at which he stood when he was trying to see with his ears. She thought of children's hands held near a brazier to warm the fingers and then turned to warm the backs of the hands. She thought of Winterfell, which had been made before her and would last after, and how it seemed a kind of mercy that a person could sit inside a room that cared more about itself than about the person sitting in it. You were not the center, and this freed you to make better decisions. She came from the godswood with a face that was calm and not untroubled, and the men in the yard read that, as men will read a lady's face, though they pretend they cannot, and found in it a measure for their own days. Tyrion came toward her across the packed snow, his breath making small puffs that admitted the cold was winning the argument at the moment, and he did not mind conceding. "We will be visited," he said. "We will be ready." "Ready," he echoed, and the word traveled a little in the air between them and then settled. "If we are lucky, we will use the word many times in the next month, and it will mean a different thing each time and still be true." She looked up at the windows of the great hall, which reflected the gray light and gave nothing away. "There will be mistakes?" she said calmly. "Yes," he said. "Make them early and small." "And if we cannot make them small?" she asked. "Make them early then," he said, and his mouth tilted. "That is all that can be done with mistakes you must make. The North will forgive less than the South, but it will forgive more honestly." She nodded. "We will ride out tomorrow," she decided, "along the East Road, to greet those coming, to be seen, and to count," he said. "And to count," she agreed. The next morning broke very clear, and the cold had the purity of a sharpened blade. They went with a small escort and 2 boys who had been chosen by Hilda, without telling them, because they would ride properly and not fall off and embarrass everyone and themselves. The road received them. Sansa looked at the light on the snow and thought of the way the old gods look slowly. And then the old thought came to her, that Winterfell looks after those who look after it. It was a thought fit only for a child, and for a woman about to receive a guest she did not want. It put a shape in her spine that helped her sit. They met people on the road in 2s and 3s, and a family with a cart. That was a summary of a life. A bedstead lashed to it. A sack with something the shape of a kettle. A bundle that must be a baby because it moved and made the sound of a very small person who decides at strange moments to announce the reality of existence. Sansa spoke the words of hospitality that are the North's law. Not beautiful, not variable, the same every time, because that is their strength. Tyrion asked the father how far he had come and learned how many steps one takes when a child is this heavy and you are this kind of tired. He shared a joke with the mother about cabbage that made her put her hand to her mouth to stop a laugh from blowing warmth away too quickly. He counted the cows. A man said he did not have, and assessed the width of the man's shoulders, who said he could not lift another day, and decided which of the 2 was lying and which merely mistaken. They turned back before dusk because the light in the north has an edge in winter that cuts faster than you think. As they came into the yard, a boy ran toward them, and then stopped, because he remembered to be a boy and not a dog, and stood and waited with his chest heaving, and said, "A letter," and thrust it out with a hand that had a hole in the glove's forefinger. Sansa took it. It was sealed with a signet pressed lightly and then pressed again harder, as if the first attempt had been too gentle. She broke it and read. It was from a man who named himself a Frey. The words were tidy and oily. They expressed a desire to visit Winterfell as friends of the Warden and to see that things were being done in the right order. They did not ask. They suggested. They made promises of meat that does not travel well and of men whose company travels worse. They mentioned Ramsay Bolton in a way that made the name look like a knife left in a room. Sansa read it twice. She handed it to Tyrion. He read it once and looked at the snow without seeing it. "Our house," he murmured, "is the nail men have decided to hang their cloaks on because it is nearest the door." She nodded. "We will not let them put their wet things where they please. We will need Manderley's oaths to be louder than their letters," he said. "They will be," she said quietly. "We will make sure." She looked up at the towers. The smoke from the kitchen went straight for a time, then gusted, then straightened again. The sky was iron. The land lay white and not asleep, but watching. She felt the house behind her like a spine of stone. She believed, not as a girl believes what she is told, but as a woman believes what she has stood open-eyed to witness, that Winterfell would keep faith with those who kept faith with it. She looked at Tyrion. He looked back. There is a way two people can share a look that makes a kind of bridge. They crossed it and came back, and the yard seemed less wide afterward. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will gather the men who must be told, and the women who must be listened to. We will speak of frays and of pies and of roads, and of what we will do when men who do not love us eat at our table. Then die. And we will count," he said softly. "And we will count," she said. Snow began again, very fine, as if someone had found a bag of flour with a hole in it and was shaking it gently over the day. The boys who had ridden with them were arguing quietly about the weight of the baby seen on the road. Hilda's voice came from the hall with the sound of a spoon on a pot. Somewhere, the old gardener spoke to the lemon tree again, telling it a story about warm places, as if the telling were an act of mercy. The north held its breath and let it out and took it in again, working as it does under its own laws. Winterfell stood, and inside it a girl who was a woman, and a man who was a husband, made a beginning out of what they had, which is what beginnings always are.